Our next storyteller, when asked what was her favorite place at Barnard and why, she said lower level Macintosh, which I think this building used to be, right? And that's why she mentioned the delicious tuna melts. Please welcome from the class of 1989, Leslie Kantor.
When I was little, my parents were legal services lawyers, and they did things like worked with farm workers around the country. So we really learned to speak up about issues and rights. In fact, my best friend, Marnie Diamond, in childhood remembers me running around saying things like, children's rights are human rights. And apparently I also said, treat me like I'm 27 all the time. And I guess I thought that 27 was when you got all the rights. But when I was 11 years old, my mother was killed in a plane crash. And that, of course, changed absolutely everything about my life, about my family's life. And we weren't very good at talking about that. We talked about that with one another actually very little. And I got through my adolescence by throwing myself into dance. You can imagine a very predictable ballet. You do the same thing every day. So I definitely recommend it while you're grieving. That's a good place to be. But I was a ballet dancer in the 80s in Los Angeles. And so I was actually in class with some of the very first people who were infected with and died of AIDS. And these otherwise healthy, robust, athletic people would disappear for a while, would often come back quite emaciated, and would sometimes die. When I came to Barnard, I came as a mid-year transfer in my sophomore year. Any other transfers? Great. But one thing about being a mid-year transfer is that absolutely nothing is starting, right? Everything starts in the fall. So there wasn't a lot to become part of. But I did see when I was walking through the tunnels one day, a flyer with, a little piece of Scotch tape saying there was going to be a first meeting of an AIDS task force. So given my connection to the issue from dance, I thought, well, I should show up at that. And I went to the first meeting. And the only thing I remember is that at least one person said, oh, our girls aren't going to have to worry about that. Now remember, it's 1987. We had no idea who was going to need to worry about that. And I think I said something like, the virus is not going to respect the gate. And I was fired up. And I started the first peer education group that ever took place at Barnard, the AIDS Peer Educators. And there are actually several AIDS peer educators here today. And we started doing AIDS 101 in all the dorms, and we educated the RAs, and we talked about things like how to use a condom, how to use a dental dam, which most of you still won't know, so real quick, latex over the vulva keeps bodily fluids out of the mouth. So now you all know too. We even talked about cleaning your drug work. So this was relatively edgy stuff. Remember the first peer education group. And in some ways, I was an extremely unlikely person to be doing this because I had never had sex yet. And I was really good at saying all the words, though. And so I was a great person to play that game I never with. Do you all know that drinking game where you say, I've never done this, I've never done that, and the other people have to drink if they've done it? I could say anything. I would play these games, particularly with a lot of gay men who I became friends with through this HIV work. So I was saying, I've never participated in water sports. I've never mutually masturbated. And everybody else was drunk and I was just sitting there. But I was very comfortable saying all the words. Maybe we taught some of you how to use condoms. So we did this group and we'd gone on for about a year. But we did have some differences with the health service. They were really anxious about those dental dams. So one day I came to my mailbox, we're here in lower level Macintosh, and there was this official letter addressed to me, typed, typewriters in those days, from Kathy Rogers, Senior Vice President and General Counsel. And it said, a moratorium has been placed on your group until further notice. We have to work out the differences in the curriculum. And I thought, a moratorium? Now remember, I'm the daughter of 2 lawyers, but I had never heard that word before. It was quite obvious what it meant. So, as a group, we did what people did in those days when people were getting in the way of preventing HIV. We went to ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. Now, for those of you who never got to go to an ACT UP meeting, it was in the basement of the Lesbian and Gay Community Center downtown, Monday nights, and about 600 people went to those meetings. So you couldn't just walk in and say what your problem was and get help. They had a very intricate set of committees that you had to go through. So I wanted something quick to happen. So I wanted to go to the action committee. Those people were cool. They were chaining themselves to the fence of Pfizer. I mean, I knew they would do something. But I think because we were a group of young women, one man, but mostly young women from Barnard, they slotted us through the Women's Caucus. Now, does anybody want to guess the format for the Women's Caucus meetings for ACT UP? Anybody want to just wild guess? You know, it didn't, but it involved potluck. So we went to these very long, drawn-out potlucks. We went to, it feels to me like 9,000 potlucks. But eventually we went through the Women's Committee and I got to go on the floor of ACT UP. I had a chance to say that our group had been shut down at Barnard College, give them the phone number for Barnard, and ask them to call and say to reinstate our group, let us do our education. That was called a phone zap. Now, for the younger people, you have to remember, there were no cell phones, there was no internet, there was no social media. But I thought, okay, hopefully a handful of people will call. I right away got a call I didn't expect from someone who heard me on the floor who said, you know, I want to call the Barnard Communications office. I'm a publisher of several publications. I need you to tell me which of these sounds the most academic. So I got all nervous, I don't know if I know what an academic sounding publication is. So I said, what are the names? He said, Torso. I said, what else? Mandate. Any others? There was also Inches and Play Guy, at which point I said, what was the first one again? But the really surprising call came the next day when I was called and told to come down to the dorm lobby. And there was the front desk person, and then there was Senior Vice President and General Counsel Kathy Rogers in the dorm, which was then called Centennial Hall. I guess it was before the Sulzbergers dished out the money to have it named after them. So Centennial Hall. There's Kathy Rogers, and she looked, she really looked like she needed my help, and she said, Leslie, I really think we're going to work out our differences on the curriculum. But is there any way you can make them stop? We cannot get any other calls into the college, nor can I make any calls out, which is why I had to walk over here. So while in this story, Barnard is in some ways the unfortunate actor. Now this is an old administration. But Barnard was also the training ground for learning to speak up and learning to speak up effectively. And if there was ever a time in this country where we all need to be able to do that, it is right now. Thank you.